In this PowerPoint, we are going to discuss contingencies of reinforcement. This is RBT task list item C3. This training program is based on the RBT task list and is designed to meet the 40-hour training requirement for RBT certification. The program is offered independent of the BACB. In this video, we are going to discuss two different topics. For starters, we will go over what reinforcement contingencies are. This will include information about positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, unconditioned reinforcers, conditioned reinforcers, and so on. Secondly, we will discuss schedules of reinforcement. This topic will cover continuous versus intermittent reinforcement, as well as some examples of reinforcement schedules that focus on number of responses and time passed. First, we will discuss reinforcement contingencies. The first type of reinforcement contingency we will discuss is positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement refers to the contingent presentation of a reinforcer resulting in an increased frequency of that response. Also, as another refresher, a reinforcer refers to a stimulus that increases the frequency of the response it follows. Using positive reinforcement involves presenting a reinforcer after a target response has occurred. The reinforcer is only presented when the target response has occurred. This makes the reinforcer contingent on the response. By doing this, we are raising the probability of the client emitting this response in the future. The following is an example of a positive reinforcement contingency that you might see while working with a client. The antecedent in this example is no tickles. The behavior is when the client gives their technician a tickles icon, and the consequence of their behavior is receiving tickles. If tickles functions as a reinforcer, the client will be more likely to engage in the response of giving the tickles icon to someone in order to come into contact with the reinforcer of tickles. Another type of reinforcement contingency is negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is the response contingent removal of an aversive stimulus, resulting in an increased frequency of that response. As a reminder, an aversive stimulus is a stimulus that increases the frequency of the response its termination follows. With negative reinforcement, an aversive stimulus, such as an unpreferred activity, is present in the antecedent condition. Then, when the client engages in a specific behavior, that aversive stimulus is removed. This increases the probability of the client engaging in that response in the future when the aversive condition is present. Negative reinforcement contingencies are often helpful in teaching appropriate behaviors. For example, if a client finds instructions aversive, you may teach them an appropriate response, such as asking for a break. By asking for a break, the aversive condition of demands will be removed. Another example is teaching a client who wears a diaper to communicate that they are in need of a diaper change. By exchanging a bathroom icon, for example, they can let those who work with them know that they need a new diaper. This contingency removes the aversive condition of being in a wet or dirty diaper. The following is an example of a negative reinforcement contingency. The antecedent involves the client having to complete work. For example, if you are running DTT with a client and currently presenting several demands. The behavior is exchanging a break icon with their technician, and the consequence is that the client no longer has to complete work. By teaching clients to engage in these responses, they can have more of a say in what happens during therapy. It is very reasonable that a client may need a break during a long session. Therefore, Rather than waiting for them to engage in problem behavior to communicate that they need a break, instead, we can teach them to engage in a communication response, such as demanding for a break to communicate this need. There are some important aspects to reinforcement that you should always keep in mind. For starters, how quick a reinforcer is delivered or an aversive condition is removed is very important. Research has shown that delivering these consequences as little as a second after a behavior has occurred is the best way to ensure we are reinforcing the behaviors we are trying to reinforce. The reasoning behind this is that if we have a delay between the behavior and the consequence, we run the risk of reinforcing a behavior that we did not mean to reinforce. For example, if you are working on quiet hands with a client and wait 5 seconds after they initially put their hands into the quiet hands position, you may deliver a reinforcer after another response has occurred, such as them taking their hands off of the table or reaching for the reinforcer that is in your hand. Because of this, you should always have a reinforcer prepared so that you can ensure it is delivered immediately following the target response. There are some clients where you may not have to rely on immediate consequences to control behavior. For example, if a client has verbal behavior, they may be able to understand rules. Rule-governed behavior is when a behavior is under the control of a rule. If behavior is under the control of a rule, then the consequence can be delivered in the future rather than immediately following the behavior. Rules are typically stated in if-then statements. If the client engages in a specific behavior, then a specific consequence will occur. For example, a rule statement you may use with a client would be, if you finish all of your homework before next session, then you can choose a toy from the toy chest to take home with you. The purpose of setting up these contingencies and ensuring that consequences are delivered immediately or clear rules are stated is to increase appropriate responding and teach new skills. If we do not have effective contingencies in place, our clients may not engage in responses that will lead to learning and skill acquisition. As behavior analysts, it is critical that we set up the environment in a way that promotes learning. To do this, we have to have effective contingencies. When setting up contingencies, we have to consider what types of reinforcers we plan to use. There are 2 types of reinforcer categories that separate reinforcers that are learned versus unlearned. These 2 categories are unconditioned and conditioned reinforcers. First, we are going to discuss unconditioned stimuli. An unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that is a reinforcer, though not as a result of pairing with another stimulus. This means that we do not have to have a prior history with a specific stimulus for it to function as a reinforcer. These stimuli are naturally reinforcing to us because of the evolutionary history of our species. The following examples are unconditioned stimuli for humans. Food. We need food to survive. Therefore, food functions as an unconditioned reinforcer. From birth, newborns engage in behaviors such as crying to receive food. Another example is water. Water is also an unconditioned reinforcer that is a product of our evolutionary history. Without water, we would not be able to survive. Sleep and warmth are also unconditioned reinforcers that we do not need a previous history with for them to function as reinforcers. Next, we are going to discuss conditioned reinforcers. A conditioned stimulus is a stimulus that has become a reinforcer because it has been paired with another reinforcer in the past. Therefore, the client must have a history with that particular stimulus for it to function as a reinforcer. These stimuli do not function as reinforcers because of evolution. Therefore, we are not born with these stimuli acting as reinforcers. They must be paired with other reinforcers in order to become reinforcers. For example, attention is a conditioned reinforcer. It has been paired with a variety of things in the past that has caused attention to acquire reinforcing properties. Additionally, points you receive in a class are conditioned reinforcers. When you are born, you do not find points or grades reinforcing. It takes a history of pairing points with reinforcers, such as an approving smile from your teacher or praise, for points to function as a reinforcer. We are now going to briefly discuss how a stimulus becomes a conditioned reinforcer. This is due to the pairing procedure. The pairing procedure involves pairing a neutral stimulus, such as attention or points, with a reinforcer. The reinforcer that this neutral stimulus is paired with can be a conditioned or unconditioned reinforcer. To pair two stimuli together, you will first present the neutral stimulus and then present the conditioned or unconditioned stimulus. In the example of attention, the infant would first receive attention, such as the mother approaching their crib, and then receive the unconditioned reinforcer, such as food. On the other hand, the pairing procedure also shows what happens in the absence of these stimuli. In the absence of a neutral stimulus, the conditioned or unconditioned stimulus will also be absent. For example, in the absence of attention, such as the mom does not walk up to the crib, the unconditioned stimulus of food will also be absent. These pairings result in the neutral stimulus acquiring the reinforcing properties of the stimulus it has been paired with. Therefore, attention will no longer be considered neutral and will instead be a reinforcer. It is important to understand contingencies of reinforcement, as it affects how we interact with and work with our clients. It is important to know the difference between a reinforcer and a stimulus that does not act as a reinforcer. A stimulus is not a reinforcer unless it increases the frequency of the response that it follows. If you are presenting a stimulus following a response, and the response frequency does not appear to increase or maintain, it is likely that you do not have a true reinforcer. Just because you think a client should like a certain item or activity does not mean that they actually do or will like it. Everyone has different preferences based on their behavioral history. Therefore, we cannot assume that everyone will like the things that we expect them to like. When running procedures, we should pay close attention to how our clients interact with items. If they appear that they are disinterested in an item, are zoning out, or avoiding the item, you may want to try different reinforcers. If you are struggling to determine what true reinforcers are for your client, you can conduct a preference assessment. Now we are going to briefly discuss preference assessments. This will also be covered more in depth in a later PowerPoint. The purpose of preference assessments is to determine what a client finds reinforcing. It is very important to conduct them, especially when you first begin working with a new client, as they provide information about what items and activities you could use to increase learning. By having a clear hierarchy of what reinforcers your client enjoys, you can prioritize specific reinforcers throughout the day or withhold a specific one and only use it during a procedure that the client is struggling with. The following is a question that you should fill out on your homework sheet. First, you should fill out the following statement under the question tab. The statement is, money is considered an unconditioned reinforcer. Is the previous statement true or false? I'll give you guys a moment to decide. The correct answer is B, false. Money is actually considered a conditioned reinforcer. The individual must have a previous history where money was paired with other reinforcers for money to function as a reinforcer. The following is a possible pairing that may have occurred to cause money to become a conditioned reinforcer. For starters, the neutral stimulus, money, was presented. Following the presentation of money, the opportunity to buy a specific item, such as clothes or food, was presented. When money is absent, so is the opportunity to buy these items. This pairing procedure has caused money to function as a conditioned reinforcer. There are several categories of reinforcers that you should consider using when working with your client. The first category is edible reinforcers. This involves using food items to reinforce appropriate behaviors. Items could be any food that the client enjoys, such as candy, crackers, chips, etc. A second category to consider is sensory stimulation. This could involve things such as tickles, music, or flashing lights. Another category is tangible reinforcers. Some examples of tangible reinforcers are stickers, toy cars, or books. A fourth category is activity reinforcers. This is when the opportunity to engage in a certain behavior functions as reinforcement. Examples include playing a board game, taking a trip to the park, playing basketball, etc. The final category we would like to discuss is social reinforcers. This can include a variety of things such as hugs, pats on the back, praise, etc. Now we are going to discuss schedules of reinforcement. A schedule of reinforcement involves providing reinforcers contingent on the number of responses a client emits. For example, how many times the client appropriately hands over their items after hearing the instruction, "My turn." Also, the time between reinforcers. For example, if it has been 2 minutes since the last opportunity for the client to play with the car ramp. Finally, time between responses. This may involve how long it has been since the last appropriate "My turn" response the client emitted. In all of these scenarios, we are determining when to deliver a reinforcer based on predetermined criteria. Next, we will discuss specific schedules of reinforcement that you may use when working with a client. First, we will discuss continuous reinforcement. Continuous reinforcement is when a reinforcer follows every single occurrence of the target response. This means that anytime a client emits the response, the reinforcer is delivered. This is often a common schedule of reinforcement to use when you are working on new skills with a client, such as ones they recently mastered or ones they have yet to master. The following video is an example of what a continuous reinforcement schedule would look like while working with a client.
Do this. Good job. Good. What is this? Nose. Good job. Good. Do this. Good job. There you go. What are these? Earlobes. Good job. Do this. Good job. Do this. Whoa, good job. Here you go. Good. What is this? Nose. Good job. That's right. Good. Do this. Whoa, good job.
Intermittent reinforcement is another type of schedule of reinforcement that you may use with your clients. Intermittent reinforcement refers to a reinforcement schedule in which the reinforcer follows the response only once in a while. Your BCBA should specify how often the reinforcer should be delivered. This is a common method to use when working on skills that are mastered. For example, if your client has a strong history of engaging in appropriate responses when given the direction, "My turn," you may provide reinforcement for every few "My turn" responses rather than every single "My turn" response. The following video is an example of what an intermittent reinforcement schedule would look like while working with a client.
Do this, clap hands, do this, do this, do this. Good. Good job. Nose, good. Ears, good. Do this, good. Do this, good. Do this. Wow, good job. Here you go. Good. Where's your eyes? Oh, that's right. What is this? Hand. Good. What are these? Ears. Good. Do this. Good job. Oh, good job.
We are now going to discuss ratio schedules. A ratio schedule refers to when you focus on the number of responses that a client emits. One example is a fixed ratio schedule. A fixed ratio schedule refers to when the reinforcer is contingent on the last of a fixed number of responses. For example, if you are in a fixed ratio 2 schedule, also known as an FR2, you will provide a reinforcer after every second response. Therefore, your client would have to complete 2 imitation targets, for example, before having access to reinforcers. Another type of ratio schedule is a variable ratio schedule. A variable ratio schedule is when the reinforcer is contingent on the last of a variable number of responses. For example, if you are in a variable ratio of 2 or VR2 schedule, you will provide a reinforcer for about every 2 responses. If you're working on imitation with a client, you may provide a reinforcer after the first response, and then require 3 consecutive responses before allowing access to another reinforcer. At the end of the session, the amount of responses required to receive a reinforcer should average to 2 responses. Another type of schedule of reinforcement is interval schedules. An interval schedule focuses on the passage of time to determine when to provide reinforcers. The first type of interval schedule we will discuss is a fixed interval schedule. This is when the reinforcer is contingent on the first response after a fixed interval of time since the last opportunity for reinforcement. For example, if you are in a fixed interval of 2 seconds or an FI 2 seconds, you will provide a reinforcer after both the passage of 2 seconds and after the client emits the target response. This means you need both the 2 seconds to pass and for the response to occur after the 2 seconds have passed for the client to receive the reinforcer. Additionally, we also have variable interval schedules. This is when a reinforcer is contingent on the first response after a variable interval of time since the last opportunity for reinforcement. For example, if you are in a variable interval of 2 seconds or an VI 2 seconds, you will provide a reinforcer after both the passage of about 2 seconds and after the client emits the target response. This means you need both approximately 2 seconds to pass and for the response to occur after the 2 seconds have passed for the client to receive the reinforcer. Another type of interval schedule is a fixed time schedule. A fixed time schedule is when a reinforcer is delivered after the passage of a fixed period of time, independent of the response. For example, if you are in a fixed time schedule of 2 seconds, you will provide a reinforcer every 2 seconds independent of responding. This means that the client does not have to emit a specific response to receive the reinforcer. All that needs to occur is the passage of time. Here is a case study. Make sure to write this question down on your homework packet. You are working with your client Sydney on a new procedure that involves imitation. Sydney rarely engages in the correct response when you ask her to imitate clapping hands. What schedule of reinforcement should you use when working on imitation of clapping hands with Sydney? A. an FR2 schedule, B, a VR2 schedule, C, an FR1 schedule, or D, a VI 2 seconds schedule. I'll give you guys a moment to look over the answers and determine what you think is correct. The correct answer is C, an FR1 schedule. FR1 is another way to describe a continuous reinforcement schedule. A continuous reinforcement schedule is when you provide a reinforcer after every occurrence of the target response. A fixed ratio of 1 is continuous reinforcement, as you are delivering a reinforcer following every single response. Continuous reinforcement, or FR1 schedules, are very important to use when working on new skills. If the client is not emitting the response consistently, it is important to provide high levels of reinforcement for those times when they do engage in the correct response. By doing this, you will increase the likelihood that they will emit the target response in the future. The following is another case study example. Again, make sure to fill out the following question and answer on your homework packet. While working with your client, Lori, your BCBA tells you to reinforce about every 2 times she completes a My Turn demand. What sort of reinforcement schedule is this? A, a VR5, B, a VI 2 seconds, C, a VR1, or D, a VR2. I'll give you guys a moment to look over the answers and determine what you think is correct. The correct answer is D, a VR2 schedule. As a reminder, VR stands for variable ratio, which means an average of a specified number of responses. If you are reinforcing about every 2 responses, you will vary between reinforcing every 1 to 3 responses. We are now going to watch a video of a DTT session between a technician and a client. Pay close attention to the reinforcement schedule that the technician is using, as this is what you will be questioned on afterwards.
Do this. Do this. Good job. What is this? Ear. Good. Do this. Good job. Do this. Good. Do this. Good job. Do this. Good. Do this. Good job. Do this. Good job. Do this. Good job. What is this?
The following is a question that you should write down on your homework packet. What reinforcement schedule was the technician using while working with the client? A, an FR1, B, a VR2, C, an FR2, or D, an FI 2 seconds. I'll give you guys a moment to look over the answers and determine what you think is the correct answer. The correct answer is C, an FR2 schedule. The technician in the previous video was using an FR2 schedule of reinforcement. After every 2 responses the client emitted, a reinforcer was delivered. It was always after every 2 responses, which means that it was a fixed ratio schedule and not a variable ratio schedule. We are now going to watch another video of a DTT session between a technician and a client. Pay close attention to the reinforcement schedule that the technician is using, as this is what you will be questioned on afterwards.
Do this. Good. Do this. Do this. Good job. Do this. Good job. Do this. Good. Do this. Good job. Do this. Good job. Do this. Do this. Do this. Good job. Do this. Good. Do this. Good. Do this. Do this. Do this. Good.
This is the question that you should write down on your homework packet. What reinforcement schedule was the technician using while working with the client? A, a VR2 schedule. B, an FR3 schedule. C, a VR5 schedule. Or D, an FR2 schedule. I'll give you guys a moment to look over the answers and determine what you think is correct. The correct answer is A, a VR2 schedule. In this example, the technician was using a VR2 schedule. The reinforcer was delivered after an average of 2 responses. Reinforcers were delivered after 1 response, 2 responses, and 3 responses. This would average out to be about every 2 responses by the end of the session. Here is a summary of the information discussed in this video. It is crucial to set up contingencies of reinforcement effectively. This involves using true reinforcers. If you are using an item, edible, or activity that the client does not find reinforcing, learning will not occur. You also must choose reinforcement schedules based on current performance. You should always consider continuous reinforcement for new skills and behaviors, and set up some intermittent reinforcement for mastered skills. Continuous reinforcement is when you provide reinforcers for every correct response the client makes, while intermittent reinforcement involves providing a reinforcer every once in a while. To make the difference between fixed and variable schedules, as well as interval and ratio schedules more clear, we've provided the following breakdown. The first word will be fixed or variable. This will signal whether you are attending to a specific or average number of responses. The second word will be ratio or interval. This will refer to whether you are attending to the amount of responses or the amount of time.